Hello, everybody. Good morning. Welcome. Thanks for coming out here. Thanks for joining our session on designing Android UI for tablet and for phone, and specifically on Honeycomb. My name's Matias Duarte. I run the UX team for Android. Up here on stage with me are Robertson, Rich Fulcher, Adam Powell, and Roman Nurik, and they're going to help speak through all the different aspects of designing UI here. Before we get started talking about the fun stuff, let's do the administrative stuff. Make sure you get the cool apps here that'll help you give feedback. Also download the Google I/O Android app, which has these same links. We're going to use the Google I/O Android app as an example for some of this stuff, so take a look at that. By the time we get to that, you'll have plenty of time to have downloaded it, so if you start downloading it now, you should be set. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about the context. We're going to spend some time talking about Honeycomb and the visual design of Honeycomb, which we're codenaming Holograph. Then we're going to talk about the tablet UI patterns, and then, again, spend some time using the Google I/O app as an example for that. So first, though, some context. What were our design goals for Honeycomb? On any given project, you always have way more that you want to do than you possibly have time to do. So it's very important to decide which part of the pie you're going to bite off. So we decided to do three things at three different scales, starting from the very big and ambitious down to the more tactical. And that first, most ambitious goal was to actually advance the state of computing. Mobile computing in specific, but computing in general. Now, thankfully, we've come away since this picture was taken. But there still is a lot to do in terms of advancing how we use computers. And that focus resulted in some of the system-level changes that you guys can take advantage of with Honeycomb, specifically things like the visible, tangible, recent task switching, which we just recently made scrollable and more interactive in the 3.1 update yesterday. It also resulted in things like the actionable, more customizable notification system. So that was the big goal. We also wanted to specifically focus on making the best possible tablet experience. That meant not just transitioning our UIs that had worked on phones and making them bigger and just making sure that they worked, but really optimizing them for phones. And so that actually leads to one of the things we're going to talk a little bit about later today, the way that we allow you to have multiple column and multiple fragment type layouts in your applications, and how you make choices about when it's appropriate to use what number of columns and how you transition those columns and those states between portrait and landscape and between your phone and your tablet apps. And the third goal was the blocking and tackling, really spending some time making sure we move the ball forward on improving the basic usability of Android. There's a lot of ground for improving the usability of any platform, of any project. So we focused on a couple of the biggest, most painful points. The discovery problem people have in many applications where they don't understand what all the possible actions are, the out-of-sight, out-of-mind problem that's created with the menu button and hiding options under the menu button, and a lot of the confusion or complication that resulted from navigation and the difference between navigating back through the system backstack and navigating up inside applications themselves. So these guys are going to talk in more detail about how we actually accomplish those three goals. But the most important thing I want you to keep in mind as you're looking at all this is that this really is just the beginning of a journey for us. This is the first of many, many steps for Android. It's always an ongoing evolution. And with Honeycomb, you can see that commitment that we've got towards making interfaces more tactile, more flexible, more immersive, start to come to life. And it's just something that's going to accelerate more and more. And I wish I could tell you about how we're going to do it in Ice Cream Sandwich. I'm sure a lot of you want to ask questions about how we're going to do it in Ice Cream Sandwich, but you're just going to have to stay tuned for that. So with that, I'd like to invite Robertson up, who's going to talk about the visual design of Honeycomb.
All right, so you might have noticed that the visuals for Honeycomb have changed a little bit from what they were like in Gingerbread. And Matias was talking about some of these overarching goals. When we were thinking about the visuals, one of the things we wanted to do was make a UI that would make the user feel powerful. It's not enough just to make a device that looks like it can do a lot and where the device is powerful. The user needs to feel enabled and in control. Now, this kind of power and control requires UIs that can be dynamic and that can change based on users' needs and expectations. We realized that to do this, that we would need a visual language that would move beyond static screens that were made out of photoshopped plastic or metal or leather. So as we were looking for inspiration, we were inspired by the immediacy of heads-up displays in game UIs. We were inspired by the Hollywood holographic UIs that wrap around their users and seem to react instantly to their every intent. And one of the characteristics that we realized these UIs had is that they were essentially digital. We wanted to create a language that really utilized the flexibility of the screen. In fact, as we were designing, we joked that the metaphor for our screens was that they were screens. So some of our more specific goals. We wanted to enable then these flexible dynamic UIs. And we also wanted to simplify, open up the design, and enable extensibility so that any new visual language we made would allow for applications to represent their own brands in a strong and powerful way. So I wanted to show a couple of the drawings that led to the final design that shipped. As you can see here, the music carousel as the albums are loading in. Before the album art loads, you can see a hint of the wireframe behind it. Or in the case of a list where users try to scroll beyond where the list allows, the energy of the scroll is dissipated and escapes as light. And you might have recognized this as something we snuck into the Gingerbread release. But the idea is that we use physical and spatial and tactile cues, but at the edges and underneath, we give users a hint that this thing is created digitally, and we prepare them for more advanced kind of we use the term techno-magical things to happen. So one example of this is with the multitasking UI. You can see that on the edges of the screenshots, you have a hint that these things are created digitally. And this gives a user a cue and helps them understand that they're going to be able to very quickly switch context and understand how the screen is going to redraw. But it's not enough just to create UIs that are quick and responsive. It's important that users understand where they are and what's happening so that they feel like they're in control of the device and not the other way around. So in the case of the home screen editor UI, when a user picks up a widget and drags it onto the home screen expands, and an echo of that widget is projected onto a grid that is visible as you scroll around. So this kind of heads up immediate transformative UI enables us to have this kind of flexibility. And like Matias says, this is just the beginning. We want to bring more of this. So in another example, even in cases where these holograms, if you will, are resolved into full 3D objects that are opaque and cast shadow, even here we give the user a hint that they're in a virtual space by how the books are hovering over this implied floor. It tells users that they can expect a list of books that goes on, that they're not going to run out of space in their bookshelf. Okay, so as we look to have more flexibility, we realize that UI that changes with user needs can also become more simple and more open. So this is a sheet that shows the UI elements that make up the light theme, the holo.light theme. And you can see that we've pushed to simplify elements. We want to solve more design problems with space and with typography. and not necessarily have to draw a plastic box around every element. So here's an example of how it starts to play out. If you notice the compose screen from Gingerbread on the left, the purpose of the screen is absolutely clear to the user. We felt like the number of boxes or number of containers that showed up on the screen added some unnecessary complexity. So on the right, you'll see the Holo light theme and how some of those form elements are represented. You'll see that even the text boxes aren't boxes. It opens up the design and makes for an approachable and easy to understand interface. And you'll notice that in the compose space, we don't even have a box. We just left a big open space to invite people to write their mails. Even on list elements, as we expanded them out to the tablet, we looked to keep the design open. The divider lines start to become more like typographic rules than bounding boxes that make list elements into tiles. Now, as we started to remove some of the kind of the structural boxes that surrounded things, we realized that the spacing and the grid and the metrics became more important than ever. The design of the Holo theme is based on a 16-dip baseline grid, which baseline grids are something that graphic designers and typographers like to nerd out on, but it really does make a big difference in creating a screen that's ordered and that has strong hierarchies and is easy to understand. You can see here, this is the sub-column grid that we use to lay out the interfaces. And you'll notice as you start to build with these underlying structures that you'll need less and less of the boxes that show up on top of the UI. And then lastly, we really wanted to create a UI that could get out of the way and let application brands really shine through. And as you're starting to do this, a few of the tips that I wanted to talk about. The first thing you'll need to do is choose a light or dark theme. The Holo elements are optimized for light and dark backgrounds now. And consider as an easy first step to switch out some of the primary colors for the UI elements. And then one new thing in the Holo UI is also we have background images on most screens. You'll have to be careful to not put too much complexity back there where it conflicts with your content. But very quickly you can go a long way to express the brand in your application through those backgrounds. And then just as you're overriding those themes, just make sure that for each element you use that you override each state. It's easy for some of those extra states to sneak through. And then as you're opening up the design and removing the boxes, again, the spacing and metrics really matter. One place where this shows up when you're porting phone apps to tablets, you'll notice that on phones, a lot of times we'll fill things to parent, and then on a 10-inch tablet screen, those line lengths can sometimes be way too long. The buttons can get way too wide, so pay attention to that. And then lastly, as you're looking to promote the brand of your product in the marketplace, we've given some new and better opportunities for applications to show the visuals of their brand through a larger high-res market icon, 512 by 512. And if you think about your users scrolling through the app marketplace and think about the things that they're using to decide whether or not your app is a high-quality app, it turns out that the quality of the rendering and the execution of your icon is a really strong signal that people use to determine whether your application will be a quality application. So there's an opportunity there. And then also, we've introduced new feature banner graphics and promotional graphics, again, to let people see what your application is and your brand is about. So with that, I'm going to hand the time over to Rich and Adam, who are going to talk about some of the UI patterns and framework features. from Honeycomb.
So hi, I'm Rich Fulcher. I'm one of the interaction designers on Android.
And I'm Adam Powell. I'm a framework engineer. I work to make some of this a reality.
So we're going to look at a few different UI patterns today. Just for those of you who missed the talk last year or just aren't familiar, a UI pattern is very much like a software design pattern. It's a general solution to a recurring problem. It's not necessarily the perfect one. It's not always even appropriate, but it's generally a good way of going about solving the problems that we hit repeatedly. These are, in general, framework supported, and we'll be talking kind of about that as we go. And also, they're not restrictions. These are just guidelines. These are practices that you can follow that we've found to be successful. We'll talk about 4 different topics today. We'll start with the action bar, move on to some tips for multi-pane layouts. We'll talk about app navigation, and then we'll close with a little bit of discussion of how you go beyond simple lists. So first up, the action bar. So this isn't a new pattern. If you were here last year, we talked about action bars, and I said, go make merry, make lots of action bars, and you did, so thank you. If you look around in the market today, you see lots of apps using this pattern. We haven't been idle either, so we've been working on this pattern a lot, as hopefully you can see in Honeycomb. You can see the trajectory behind where we were last year and where we are now. And we added some new features and new capabilities into the action bar. But just a quick reminder, the action bar is kind of reserved real estate at the top of the screen. It's used for navigation and for indicating the view that the user is looking at. And most importantly, it's used for presenting the most frequently accessed actions to the user so they don't have to go into the menu structure to get those. It's also a convenient way of handling menu and search when you have devices that lack those physical hard keys. So in general, the action bar has 3 sections, as we've done it in Honeycomb. So on the far left, you've got your app icon. In the middle, you've got your view details, which also has a navigation component to it. And on the right-hand side, you have the collection of action buttons. One way to think of it is, from the user's perspective, the first is, where am I? The middle section is, well, what can I see? And the last is, what can I do here? So starting on the left, the app icon doesn't have to be your app's icon. It could also be a logo, other branding. It's mainly here to give the user a sense of place. And we also use it for navigation, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. As you move to the right, the middle section is the view details. This can be very simple. This could just be a title, as you're used to using title bars in Android today. But you can put more interactive elements into it as well. So you can put in tabs or drop-downs, breadcrumbs, things like that. And then finally, at the right, you have the actions themselves. Again, these are the most important, most frequently used actions you want to collect here. You can present them as text, as icons, as text and icons, your choice. And also, we have an overflow menu here. So you can present your most important actions in the bar. Less frequently used actions can just be demoted into the overflow menu. And in fact, that's our guidance for things like settings and help that we don't think a user needs to get at all the time, but we want to have in a consistent location across different applications. We also support the action bar transforming into a contextual mode. Once the user makes a selection on the screen, you can change the action bar so that it is more tightly tied to the selection as opposed to just the entire screen. It still has 3 sections. You still have kind of an I'm done, I'd like to leave it on the left, a set of view details in the middle, and on the far right-hand side, the set of actions that you would take with it. How do we implement this? Action mode.
We do have a few implementation details for this talk. So the action, whoops. Actually want to be still on this page for a minute. So as we take a look at the problem that the contextual action bar solves here, most developers and users are familiar with the idea that you can touch and hold on a particular element to get a context menu. Well, there's kind of a problem with context menus as soon as you have more content on a larger screen. And that's that oftentimes you'll want to interact with several pieces of that content at once. And a context menu, you have to make a choice or get out. You have to take the action right away. What the action modes let you do is you can start an action mode from any view, similar to the way that you can start or show your context menu from any given view. This lets you, like Rich said, sort of flip the action bar over and offer a series of actions that the user can take on your content. This is really handy for things like text selection, multiple selection, anything where you might want to sort of revise your context in flight once you know what you're able to do with it. But this is also part of just the standard action bar, and this is one of the things that the new action bar APIs in Honeycomb can do. So in general, an action bar is not particularly difficult to create in an application before Honeycomb either. Stick a layout at the top of your activity, stick some buttons there. What's hard about this? Why do we need a separate API for this? Well, not only can we do things like the action modes that let it do double duty, but we also have the ability to offer some consistency, offer an implementation of some of these common design paradigms. So to get a basic action bar, you can use either of the default Holo themes offered in Honeycomb, theme.holo or theme.holo Lite. If your target SDK version, as declared in your manifest, is 11 or above, then theme.holo is your default theme. The action items themselves over on the right side of the bar actually come from your options menu. So the implementation details of this end up being pretty much identical to what you're used to when you're populating your options menu panel on previous versions of Android. So for customizing the action bar, you can actually obtain an instance of the action bar object from your activity, call various methods on it, place custom views into it, edit the menu, invalidate as necessary, so on and so forth. And we also offer some customization in terms of how you want to show each menu item as an action as you populate your menus. So again, it's not too difficult to write a custom action bar implementation before Honeycomb. And the Google I/O app actually shows an interesting way of doing this that still takes advantage of the options menu items that you may already have available. So alternatively, you can still continue using the default options menu on previous versions of the platform. It's something that users are already familiar with using. So more reasons about why to use the new action bar APIs versus just rolling your own. Once we start moving down to phones and smaller screens again, some of these patterns start to break down a little bit. Suddenly, you want to start swapping out elements for a little bit more space-conservative variants. You might want to reduce icon plus text into just the icon alone, even if it may not be quite as descriptive as you may like when you have more room available to you. And the overflow icon may no longer be appropriate if you have a physical menu key still on the device. So what can you do about this? You can also split a single bar into two.
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to.
No, that's fine.
Over here?
Yeah, a good approach to this is if you, especially in portrait on a phone device, the amount of real estate you have becomes highly constrained very, very quickly. So if you're trying to do something like tabs is a great example if you look at the I/O app. I'll actually just skip to that slide really quick. There's three different strategies at play here. Adam already mentioned a couple of them. Take something like that new action and reduce it just to an icon. Move other actions that were in the overflow menu into the menu hard key. And then finally, take the bar itself and split it across two lines. Actions at the top and view details below that. Or you could split it up the other way as well. You could have view details at the top and just put actions at the bottom of the screen.
And even then, we're still maintaining a little bit of the same patterns that you described before, where we try to separate out the idea of the anchoring and navigation component, which we're showing at the top of the phone UI in this case, from the actions which still appear at the bottom of the screen in the form of the options menu.
Yep. OK, our next pattern is multi-pane layouts. I'm sure as you've been playing with your tablets, you've been appreciating all the real estate that you have compared to older Android devices. We do too as designers. So we want to pack more and more content into every screen. One way we've approached that is for certain spaces, we put in kind of multiple view panes within a single screen. It gives the user a little bit more context for what they're operating on. It can divide up the space, and it avoids some of the very long line widths that you sometimes run into. You don't want a button that spans the entire width of a tablet device. In general, we kind of rely on the notion that as the user kind of reads from left to right across the screen, that the details kind of get more and more specific. If I'm seeing a list, it then leads to details for an item. one of the trickier parts of using multi-pane layout is when you get into changing the device's orientation. So we have kind of one rule that we want you to adhere to, and then a couple of strategies for how to deal with that. The rule is that we want to preserve functional parity between the two orientations, meaning if the user is in one view, they should be able to achieve all of the same actions that they can in the other. We never want the user to have to reorient the device to kind of stay and complete the task that they're trying to achieve. So we've developed a few strategies that help you get at this. And these strategies are really just kind of on a screen-by-screen basis. The same application can use a number of these strategies depending on the context it's depicting. And happily, even the Google apps that you'll see cover these strategies. So we have good examples of each of them. We tried to kind of go broad in the apps that we were creating. So the simplest strategy is stretch. If I've got two columns, one of them just gets smaller and smaller and smaller. If you look at settings, that's how we deal with that. You have a left-hand list which enumerates all of the settings on the device, and that shrinks as we go into portrait. The second is that you can kind of stack or rearrange the panes within the view. We use this pretty nicely, I think, in Calendar, where you have a major pane that is your day or your week or your month view, and then supporting panes. When you rotate the device, we just kind of keep those panes. Those panes contain their own identities, and they just kind of shift around within the screen. The last two strategies are actually closely related. We call them expand collapse, which is one that we use in Google Talk. There you have a friends list on the left and then an active chat on the right. And as the device orients, the friends list, instead of having name and icon, just kind of reduces in size, so it's just showing the icons of the different people in your friends list. You can still expand it back by pressing and bringing it back to its kind of original landscape width. A variant of that is what we do in Gmail when you're reading a conversation and you're in portrait view, is that we kind of tuck away the list of conversations and it slides off the screen to the left. But we give the user, using up and back, a way to kind of bring that back on and select a different conversation or select multiple conversations.
All right. So how would you go about implementing some of this? If you watched the talk about sort of an intro to Honeycomb yesterday, you've already heard about the Fragment class and what it's able to do as part of the new Honeycomb API. If you've watched the Android developer blogs, you've seen this before as well. So the two entry points to this new API are going to be the Fragment class itself and optionally the Fragment tag in your layout XML. They can actually have presence within your layouts. So a really quick intro to fragments in general. They're fragments of an activity. It's the best way to think of them. It's a way to split up the idea of an activity into multiple components. And as a result of that, they become a unit of reuse between activities. The same fragment can have a presence in multiple activities across your app. So depending on what makes sense for your app in terms of how you want to display your content on a phone versus on a tablet, then you may arrange those fragments a bit differently. It also helps with just general separation of concerns. This is not a new software engineering principle at all at this point, but how many of you have ever written just an onCreate method that has to wire up a whole bunch of different pieces of your UI, and it just starts getting very, very large as your UI gets more complex? This lets you sort of separate out a bunch of those pieces into a little bit more manageable components. But fragments also don't necessarily have views. They're a lifecycle construct, not necessarily a visual construct. Like an activity, a fragment gets a number of lifecycle callbacks for creation, when it gets attached to an activity, and on general destruction as well. And they can also save state in between orientation changes, similar to the way that activities do. But this is a talk about UI, so we're going to go ahead and try and stay a little bit more focused on that. I mean, as Rich already knows, I can talk about fragments for a really long time. So for compatibility, I mean, obviously we haven't shipped any phones running Honeycomb right now, so a Honeycomb-only API doesn't do developers a whole lot of good if we're really presenting this as a way of dealing with these vastly differing device configurations. So we have the Fragment support library that's available, free, open source. Go ahead, download it, use it. This will work all the way back to Android 1.6, so that's Donut. So it covers pretty much everything that's still live and active in the market right now. So all activities extend fragment activity when you're using this. You can get the support fragment manager. Most of the rest of the API is pretty similar from there on. But take a look at the link that's on the slide here if you want to know more about that. the interesting thing about creating some of these multi-pane layouts that Rich is describing is that fragments are really only one part of that story, and they're actually kind of a small part of that as well. Most of the heavy lifting when working with these apps is actually done by the Android resource system that's been in place for quite a while. You've probably seen this sort of a configuration before as you write your apps. You may lay out several directories in your resource folder for working with different density screens. So you may have a version of a particular image for low, medium, and high density screens. But what you may not have seen before is that we have a whole bunch of configuration specifiers that the resource system can pick from for you at runtime. So the resource system always tries to pick the best fit for the current configuration that you've provided as an app developer. So in this case, as you're working with different screen sizes, you can provide different layouts for normal, large, X large screens in portrait, all across the spectrum. You choose where you decide to make these cuts. So how does this actually work out in practice? Activities can inflate layouts with different fragment configurations. So if you provide different layout files, then it suddenly makes it a whole lot easier to create effects like Rich mentioned with the stack here. So since fragments can actually have presence in layout, you write your layouts in such a way that basically says, where do these containers go on my screen? Where do these panes show up? And this becomes your activities layout that you use to your set content view call. So in this case, this version of the layout is placed in layout X large land. So this is our landscape layout for X large screens. But with a few really simple changes, we can create a portrait version of the same layout. Now, none of your Java code actually changes in this case. Everything just kind of wires itself up. You get orientation changes as long as your fragments are set up to pass their state to their new versions, just like you would with an activity. And suddenly, you're able to deal with very robust orientation changes with very little work on your part. So there's a few other handy uses of the resource system that you might want to take advantage of as you're writing your tablet apps here as well. So not only can fragments use layouts with different view configurations, so these are the panes themselves. List items, you can have those individual layouts be more detailed or compact as needed, depending on the space available. And even very simple resources like integer constants or Boolean constants can have different values from one configuration to another. So if your code is dependent on a particular configuration setting in that regard, then the resource system can actually do that selection for you, and you don't have to worry about doing those tests yourself. Navigation.
App navigation. This is actually one of the areas we made some really significant changes in Honeycomb. I haven't heard as much discussion about it in the press, but it's a big area. I wanted to take us into it in a little bit of detail. One of the critical changes in Honeycomb is that we now have a much wider array of mechanisms via which the user can kind of dive deeply, directly into a lower level of an application. You know, some examples of that are you have richer notifications, where now a notification can contain a set of controls with it that can take you to different destinations or perform other actions. You have these rich home screen widgets, which give you more of a glimpse of the app's content and let you pick a particular piece of content and go right into that in the app. And you have recents, as we talked about earlier. So traditionally, navigation in Android has been based on the user's temporal memory, meaning kind of just users are good at remembering what just happened. They're slightly less good at remembering a sequence of things that happened shortly ago. So knowing what just happened is great for hitting back and just snapping back one step to the prior context. But it gets there's more potential for confusion, a bad kind of user confusion, if the app has a longer sequence built into it. The example I like to give for this is if you go to a grocery store. You go to the grocery store, you go to the produce aisle, and you fill your cart with 7 or 8 things. If I were to stop you as you're exiting that aisle and say, what was the last thing you picked up? You can probably say, kumquat. I know that, yeah. If I asked you to take the 7 things in your cart and order them in the reverse order that you picked them up, that's a much heavier task. And not necessarily one, even if you can perform it well, it's the kind of cognitive load we don't want to impose on users. Users are good at structural memory. They remember the relationship between different screens within the same application. And users have a lot of strong conventions built up from the web context that there's a convenient way for me to get home or get upward in the upper left of the app. And as users saw the action bar, they started to have that kind of expectation in testing. And it's also there are clearer suggestions of what the thing immediately above this thing will be. And the users have just a richer model there. Back to the grocery store, you probably know where all the individual aisles are. You have a good sense of that. You don't have to think about it very much. So we wanted to be able to address both of those in Honeycomb. So in addition to the system back, which still handles the history of moving between related screens, we've now added an application up, which we support through the action bar, and we just support by transforming the app icon by putting a little left-pointing chevron beside it. And that lets the user navigate hierarchy within the app. Now, sometimes those two actions will do the same thing. Here's a quick example. If I'm in contacts, I'm looking at the list of all contacts, and then I select one particular contact to see their details. Well, in this case, if I hit back, that just takes me back to the list of all contacts. If I had hit up, it would do the same thing. But that's not always true. Let's take the example in a slightly different path. Now I am start at contacts. I go see a detail for a particular contact. And then now I'm going to choose to email that contact. So I hit on their email address, and I launch into Gmail. Now we actually see distinct behaviors between back and up. Back would just walk me back to the contact details. But up from Compose would say, you know what? I want to stay within Gmail, and I want to navigate here. So what do we want you to do in the apps that you're building? The first one is pretty straightforward. Support up. If you're going to use an action bar, use that left spot to have it up affordance. The second is if you have deep system links in your app, just do a little bit of work to make sure that the back behavior matches the user's expectation. So if you're kind of deeply diving into an application from a widget, it makes sense to have back also walk up through the application.
Yeah, there's a new API for this in Honeycomb. You're familiar with just the general start activity call that you can make that just takes an intent object. There's a new start activities call that takes an array of intents so that you can actually construct an entire task stack as you begin.
The last pattern we want to cover quickly is kind of going beyond simple lists. So you've noticed in all the Honeycomb examples that Christian showed earlier, you have all these different views that you can support for these media-rich applications. We want to make it more, we want to encourage users to just browse through the content and explore a little bit more freely. And also, just going beyond simple lists lets you break up the monotony of simple list views, that you can create these hero moments within your application. They'd be a great screenshot to put in the market to demonstrate what your app can do. So we have a lot of different flavors of this in Honeycomb. If you look at the Books app, it's about showing just a handful of titles in kind of rich detail. I don't need to see a ton of different books. Just focusing on the last few that I've been reading covers a lot of use cases. YouTube goes the other direction completely and says, we're going to show you this vast sea of content that exists out there. We're going to go wall to wall with video screens, and they're going to wrap around. You can kind of even imagine that they go around behind you if the tablet were just a little bit wider. We take a kind of an in-between approach in the market where we have a promotional area that has this rich kind of exploratory component as in a pane at the top, but we also have more traditional elements on the screen as well.
Okay, so implementation of some of these things. There's not a whole lot of specific guidance that I can give for this because, as Rich said, as soon as you start doing the same thing in many places here, then it kind of dilutes the experience of some of it. So this is where we say, be really creative. We have the carousel view, which is the component that we used in several of our applications in Honeycomb, which we're open sourcing along as a sample for I/O right here. So this is implemented using the new RenderScript APIs in Honeycomb, and it's really intended for customization. So some variant on this was used for both books, YouTube, and all of our other applications that used some sort of like 3D carousel during Honeycomb's development. So take this and really sort of make it your own. We've also got a few other components that are either out already or will be shortly. We've got the fragment pager and the workspace, which encompass essentially your left to right paging navigation that a lot of you have asked us for many times in the past. But specifically, we kind of want to gear people away from using the gallery widget for a lot of this, because in general, the gallery widget is for choosing single items, single images out of sort of a film strip type of list. It's really not meant for the types of full screen things that we see a lot of developers try to do fairly commonly. And now here's Roman to walk you through sort of what happens when you bring some of this all together and using the Google I/O app.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Rich.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so we have just over 7 minutes for a demo for an application that actually took over 2 months to write. So, just kidding. So thanks, everyone. Let me quickly introduce myself. So my name is Roman Nurik. I'm on the Android Developer Relations team, a developer advocate. And I'm also the tech lead and the UI designer for the Google I/O app, which hopefully all of you have installed. And if you haven't, then please install it now, because that would make me really happy. So anyway, we're going to talk through, first of all, we're going to do a quick demo of the app. And we're going to talk through some of the things that were, I guess, swirling in our minds as we were thinking about how to implement this and how to make this a really solid demo app. So I'm going to leave this for one more second, and it's gone. So let's actually switch to the demo, to the Wolf Vision thing. So this is the I/O app on a tablet. I'm first going to demo the tablet and then jump into the phone. So here's the I/O app. And I'm actually not connected to the internet here, so you're just going to see a web page not available. So on the left, this is actually the home activity, right? On the left, you have the dashboard fragment, which is pretty much a kind of a launching point into the other parts of the app. And on the right, you have a real-time stream fragment. It's not showing up right now. So you have 2 panes, and we use this kind of these 2 panes to take this large amount of screen real estate and do something very useful with it. And you'll see later on the phone how we kind of map this to a phone. So if we first go into sessions, you'll notice a couple of things immediately. So you'll notice that at the top we have the action bar that comes with Honeycomb. For the up affordance, or the home affordance, we're actually using a logo instead of an icon. And we're also using, for that view section, just the title, which is sessions for the activity. We also have some common actions. Right now there's nothing we can really do, so it's just a search key. So let's actually go and open our own session. Now you'll see that we actually are populating that empty area, that second space, with more detail. And now you'll actually notice that there's some action buttons that are populated from that fragment. So the important thing to note here is that there are actually 3 fragments on the screen. And this will be important in a second. But 3 fragments on the screen. On the top left, you have a tracks drop-down fragment. Below that, you have the sessions fragment. And then to the right, you have the session detail fragment. So let's go and jump into schedule, which is another important part of the app. And you'll notice that here, there are actually 2 panes. On the left, you have the calendar fragment. And on the right, you have kind of an empty space where we'll populate content momentarily. So if we jump into one of these blocks, we'll notice that that gets populated with the sessions fragment from before, as we just showed in the previous screen. And again, this is just part of fragments that you can reuse them across activities. That's one of the greatest parts of them. And if we select, say, another session, we'll replace that with the session detail. And you'll notice that there are fragment breadcrumbs here that indicate kind of what is the relationship between the session detail and the sessions. And if we press back, you'll notice that the back stack is kind of very closely tied with the way fragments work. So, oh, and there's one more thing I wanted to show on this screen. You'll notice that we're actually using the workspace to allow flicking left and right between different days. So I think that's it for the, actually, oh, there's one last thing I wanted to show on the tablet, and that's what we do with portrait. So if we jump this into portrait mode, you notice that we're using the stacked orientation strategy. So basically, we're reorienting our fragments to make the most sense of the space available in portrait mode. So let's actually jump onto the phone. There we go. Let me just give that a moment to. There we go. So if we open up the I/O app on a phone, let me zoom in a bit. If you open up the I/O app on a phone, you'll notice that here there's really only one primary fragment, whereas in the tablet there were two. So here there's simply just a dashboard. And what we've done with the real-time stream, we've actually created a separate affordance in the bottom right of the screen to let you get to that as a separate activity. Now, you'll notice also that there's an action bar on the top, and as Adam and Rich mentioned, that on phones right now there's no kind of native action bar component, but this is a custom component that we'll talk about in a bit in terms of how it's implemented. And let's actually jump into sessions. You'll notice that there's actually a logical progression of 3 separate activities that performs the same task effectively as what we would have done in one activity on a tablet, simply because we don't have that much space to work with. And actually, the fragments used in these activities are all the same as the fragments used on the tablet. So again, there's endless amounts of code reuse. And that's something that's really, really powerful when using fragments. So I can't emphasize that enough. Or maybe I can. I'll stop here. OK, so I think that's all we wanted to show for the demo. Let's actually jump back to slides. So here's a very quick sample of some of the things that we just showed for those that didn't see it in full detail. I'll just quickly run through this since we're running a little low on time. Basically, you see side by side what a certain activity looks like on phone versus tablet. So how is this implemented? How does it work? The first most important thing that we can say here is that it's a single APK. It's a single binary that you can install on a phone and install on a tablet and get a very similar, but yet at the same time very different experience. It's really optimized for the device that you're on. So some of the ways in which this works, we use a lot of different resource directory qualifiers, as Adam hinted at before. The base set of resources that we provide, the base layouts, the base drawables, the base styles, dimensions, everything, those are all for the phone layout. We also added on another set of resources specifically for tablets, for Honeycomb tablets. And we do that using the xlarg v11 resource directory qualifiers. The reason we did xlarg and v11 and not just xlarg or not just large is that we really wanted to really deliver an experience for tablets, for Honeycomb tablets, that used all the great tools that Honeycomb had to offer that wasn't previously available on Gingerbread. So for example, fragment breadcrumbs is something that we used in some of the Honeycomb layouts that just weren't available in Gingerbread and below. And so we had to make a concession where, let's say you had a Gingerbread tablet, since Gingerbread does support the xlarg screen size. If you had a Gingerbread tablet, you'd still get the phone experience. It's not the optimal experience, but it's also something that still does work. And of course, we're heavily using the fragment compatibility library, which I will not beat to death by talking about more. So let's go on to the next section and talk about some of our activities. So there are really 3 different types of activities in this app. There's first the universal activity that, well, it's just I guess in quotations, it's not a real name, but universal types of activities that are the same pieces of code that run on both phones and tablets. They may use different fragments. They may have switch statements in certain cases, but most of the core code is the same. You also have phone-specific activities, such as the sessions activity, and then tablet-specific activities, such as sessions multi-pane activity. And again, the important thing here is that those are just shell code. Those are just shell activities. They don't actually have that much code in them. They're maybe 20 lines, 30 lines at most. All of the hard work is done by the fragments. We also have a couple of activity helper classes that we wrote for this. Basically, they do things like setting up the action bar, setting the kind of the title bar color, things like that. And those are, again, there's 2 separate ones. There's one just for phones, and there's one that takes what the phone code is and layers on an additional set of functionality just for Honeycomb. And so you'll notice if you look at the code that activity helper Honeycomb extends from activity helper. So it kind of layers on that extra layer of functionality if it's available. And the action bar, as Adam mentioned, is kind of a neat thing. It's kind of a tricky thing, so I'll talk about it in a little detail. Basically, the way we do it is, I mean, the action bar is basically just a set of normal views, right? It's a linear layout with some image buttons. The way it's really done is that, first of all, we have this simple implementation of the menu interface. We instantiate it. We then tell the activity to populate it with all the menu items that it thinks should be shown. So if you have 3 fragments and each one wants to show an action button, or sorry, I'm probably misusing terminology, but if each one wants to show a menu item or an action item, basically the activity will group those together, populate the menu, and then pass that to the for loop that you see here. The for loop then takes those menu items and then adds each one to the action bar. So one thing you should keep in mind here is obviously not to use this with, let's say 4 or 5 action items, since you'll be complicating the action bar, but that's something that is currently, we're kind of working on that to improve that. So actually running really low on time, so I'm going to skip through a lot of this. 2 other things that I wanted to mention really quickly is that tab drawables. You'll notice that tabs look very specific, very, very different on Honeycomb versus on Gingerbread. So we actually have customized some of our tabs so that they really mesh well with the rest of the system. For example, as you see at the top, there's kind of the Gingerbread or phone tabs, and these actually stretch to fill the entire screen. And at the bottom here are some examples of the tab drawables that we use for Honeycomb, which are more like that. And they're actually using wrap content instead of stretching to fill. And lastly, a really important point here is that you don't always have to tweak your entire layout. You can just tweak some of the dimension resources you use. So for example, if you want to just bump up the font size a bit so that's it's a bit more legible on tablets, or tweak the padding, you can do that using the resources system. And you simply just need to have separate dimensions resources for that. So that's it pretty much for the demo and the walkthrough of how it works. I really advise you to just look at the code and see what you can take from there and use in your own projects. The code for the IO 2011 app is now open source. The project was formerly the IO 2010 app, and so you should be able to get all this tablet and phone goodness there. So just to really quickly recap, we talked about kind of some of the design goals for Honeycomb. We talked about some of the influences and inspirations for the holographic UI and some visual design tips. And then Rich and Adam spent a while talking about some of our awesome new patterns that we're really advocating for. And lastly, we did a demo of the Google I/O 2011 app. So with that, I'd like to invite you all to now ask questions. You can fire up Google Moderator or ask live questions here. And do please provide us feedback so that we can give you an even better presentation next year. Thank you. So I think there's mics up here. I don't know if there are mics. Are there mics back there? There's only one mic up here. So we'll take a couple live questions, and then we'll look at moderator. We have about 5 minutes.
Will any of those components that you mentioned, like say the workspace that's inside of IO 2011 app, you're going to be repackaging those as like an Android library project for wider reuse, or is that our job?
You want to talk about that?
Well, for the moment, that's your job. It's available open source as part of the IO app right now. We may get some more libraries out there to offer a few more widgets for this functionality, but we're still kind of working on that.
Okie dokie.
Any other questions? There's one back there.
Yeah, so we're about to embark on a redesign of our application for Honeycomb. And I know you can't speak too much about ice cream sandwich just yet, but if we start going with the hologram type style of things, are we going to have to do significant redesigns when we're looking for phones in the future?
No, I'll take that one. No, everything that you see in Honeycomb represents the direction that we're taking Android in general, and you'll expect to see more of that, not exactly the same, refined and better in Ice Cream Sandwich.
Great, thank you.
So let's actually take one moderated question. Will it be possible to create HTML-based, oh, that went away. There it is. Will it be possible to create HTML-based home screen widgets in order to display a live web page, JavaScript or WebSockets on the home screen? Adam, would you like to answer that, or should I answer?
I don't think that we have immediate plans for that right now, but could look into it.
Okay. Yeah, so stay tuned. And then one more, when will a real UI design tool that's compatible with interface builder, blah, blah, blah. Basically, look at Zav's talk. I think it's coming up later this afternoon. They're going to be demoing, Zav and Tor, actually. They're going to be demoing a new UI design and layout tool that we've been working on heavily. So definitely check out that talk for that. Let's see another live question.
Thank you. I'm just wondering what the benefit is on your phone version of the app using a new activity rather than using the backstack method of fragments.
It's a good question. I don't know. I personally don't have like a preference either way. I know that you can definitely implement the same thing by just having one phone activity and then several fragments that swap in and out. I found that it was a little easier just to have separate activities. I also, we make heavy use of intents throughout the app. If you look at the intent model and the kind of the content provider model, there are a lot of things there that didn't naturally or immediately map to having just one activity. So there would be a lot of code that you'd have to re-implement. So definitely both can work. We just chose one. I think that the other could work as well. But if you guys have any other comments, but okay.
No, that covers it pretty well.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
You mentioned launching the activity with a couple of intents before the one the user actually sees. So like when they receive a notification or something. What other uses would you have for creating that backstack on launch?
Yes.
I think the biggest one is, kind of, we hinted at it a little bit here, but the general idea that users will sometimes have the expectation, if they didn't get directly referred from another application, that they're just kind of in that app, and they're expecting back to kind of move them within that app. So this was something that was kind of generated by user research, just kind of testing out the new behavior of deep dive notifications. So I think that's the most critical use case, is I dive deeply into an app. I forget exactly how I arrived there, whether it was recent or back or some other affordance. And I just, rather than just restoring you back to home, that we take you kind of gently back up through that application.
Yeah, a rule of thumb we've used for knowing when that's appropriate is if the user has used a system level affordance to really switch tasks or switch application contexts, that's a good sign that they're expecting to really kind of completely go from one building to another building. And so when you're deep linking in through a widget, when you're following a notification, when you're following some kind of specialized shortcut on home, those are all appropriate places to build them a reasonable backstack in case they don't already have it. If you're directly linking from one activity into another activity as part of one task, not the user using the system, but just using an application, that's not usually an appropriate time.
Okay, thank you.
All right, any more live questions? Yes.
Got a second one. I'm just wondering if there's going to be more development with the compatibility library. It's pretty good already, but I think it could probably be better, and I'd like to see some of the newer features as they come.
Sure.
We'd like to. What would you like to see?
Well, it'd be great if we could get the action bar in there, and also web fragment would be wonderful.
We'll take those as feature requests to ask Diane and Adam. I'll follow them at you later after that. Mm-hmm. All right. Okay, one more question up here.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Last question, I think.
So do you know when, I'm not sure if this is appropriate, so do you know when the anti-alias support will be coming into Honeycomb? Because when I twitch the wheel like 5 degrees, the lines get distorted.
So that's probably a loaded question. There are a number of different ways to do drawing, right? So are you talking about like 2D canvas drawing or?
Yeah, 2D, just like basic view. I have a view, then I kind of turned out like a few
So
degrees.
you apply like a rotation.
Yeah, yes.
Right. It's a good question. Adam, do you know the answer to that?
I think it's being worked on.
Okay, and ETA?
Not at this time, sorry.
Okay, thanks.
I think that's it for questions. Thanks everyone for coming, and yeah, give us feedback.
Thank you very much.